Good morning. I'm Bruce Lev. I'm the managing director of a privately held, almost 100-year-old investment and merchant bank located on Wall Street in New York City.
Excellent. And what type of services do you provide?
We don't provide services to the general retail community, if you will. What we do with respect to folks outside the bank is we provide investment and advisory services, if you will. That is to say, on a very small scale, if you are a private individual or educational institution, other kind of institution, or endowments, for example, you might come to us with some of your capital and ask us to invest it for you and provide general investment advice with respect to the capital you've given to us to deploy on your behalf.
Great. I know that you've had tremendous amount of success in your career. I'm curious about one of the more exciting moments in your career.
In my personal career, probably one of the most exciting moments was the day that after about almost 20 years or so of growing with others, a very early stage beginning personal computer reseller or retailer, starting with the early days of the personal computer revolution back in the early to mid 80s. My colleagues and I, after taking this company public and working very hard to grow it from 8 people in a basement in a building in Connecticut, we ultimately were able to sell the company to one of the nationally or internationally prominent private equity businesses for not just a large financial success, which of and by itself was exciting, but also success in the sense that a lot of the folks, young in the main, who started with us in the early to mid 80s, continued to grow with the company. And it was enormously exciting to see that as we sold this company, they were risen into the senior ranks of management and were onto greater things in their own careers, while we had successfully nurtured this company from its earliest beginnings to a successful close and a sale of the business so many years later.
Well, that segues a little bit into some of the deals that you've done. I'm curious about a deal that you've done, and what was the situation, and what was the strategy that you implemented, and the actions you took, and what were the results for your clients, either you or as an organization?
The deals, if you will, for our organization, Loeb Holding Corporation, are not deals in the conventional sense that most people would understand a deal. What we typically do is, not all the time, but frequently, we invest the firm's capital and capital of the owners and partners in relatively early stage and sometimes very early stage businesses. Sometimes backing a person with a great idea, sometimes backing a new technology. So for us, our successes, such as they are, and in candor, they are not always successful endings. Our successes come from nurturing those companies, helping those early stage companies grow, managing the deployment of the growth with respect to people, with respect to strategies. A couple of good examples of what I'm now talking about are, in the first instance, in the very early 80s, a couple of my colleagues, not part of the bank, but part of my general business layer of relationships, came with a notion that the world of outsourcing, in a way that people didn't really understand it, was about to happen. And by outsourcing, I mean companies that made things, for example, whether they're cars or pharmaceuticals, historically in the United States and elsewhere, did all of the things related to the distribution of those products. For example, a large pharmaceutical company made the drugs, developed the drugs, made the drugs, distributed the drugs, and was vertically integrated. My colleagues suggested it might be time to look at creating a business that would take over, i.e. outsource, some of the functions that these companies were originally performing on their own. I thought it was an extremely interesting idea, and essentially with my partners, we helped start an outsourcing business, which today is generally described as a logistics business. And for example, we went to some of the very large global pharmaceutical manufacturers and said, how about, instead of your dealing with things other than making the drug, developing and making the drug, how about letting us build warehouses designed specifically for your drugs, your products, and we'll take over the entire soup to nuts distribution, supply chain, if you will, beyond the manufacture of those products. That turned into a situation which today almost every global manufacturer of drugs doesn't do its own warehousing and distribution. It hires companies like ours to do that for them. In other words, stick to your knitting. One example of the kinds of things that related to a strategy about solving a problem or helping a company that was wrestling with that problem, and really it was a problem that could better be solved by people who focused on it. Another interesting example of a strategy that really circled and focused on looking for a problem that no one had yet really understood how to solve. And in this instance, the example is if you have roamed around the world trying to do things based on the prediction of the weather, forecasting the weather, you will very quickly understand that although the weather forecasts, particularly in the United States and the Western world, are pretty accurate, probably 20% of the time, they are not accurate as to when an event will happen or exactly where an event will happen.
Very true.
The question was, why is that so? We're a technologically advanced environment for collecting weather data and so forth, and it turned out the answer was fairly simple. And the answer was that about 90% of the data that is used by, in the United States, the National Weather Service, or in other Western world countries, weather services of their own, like in the UK and France, 90% of that data comes from the collection of data off weather balloons. And if you were ever in grammar school, I can assure you, you saw pictures of people standing in fields launching weather balloons. Weather balloons get launched. As they rise into the atmosphere up to about 90,000 feet, they collect data, weather data, temperature, moisture, wind speed, wind direction, barometric pressure, all of the pieces of data that are then dropped into very sophisticated supercomputers to crunch a forecast. And the problem was, and the reason why forecasts weren't nearly as accurate as they should be or could be, was there wasn't enough data. So we approached the problem from a new perspective. We developed sensors that collected the same data that the weather balloons collect: temperature, moisture, humidity, barometric pressure, wind speed, and so forth. And we installed those sensors, very proprietary, took a lot of time and effort and money to develop them. We installed those sensors on aircraft so that instead of waiting for the data to come off a weather balloon, and by the way, weather balloons in the world are launched only twice a day, 8 in the morning and 8 at night, no matter where you are, with large gaps in the data collection process. We installed those sensors on aircraft flying all the time. And we connected the data in those sensors to the satellite networks so that we could get the data in real time. And we took all of the balloon data, which is in the public domain, we added our own data, and we started developing and selling highly accurate weather forecasts. Just a couple of examples of the kinds of strategies that we addressed particularly strategies that looked for a problem that could be solved but needed someone who was very focused on the solution to the problem in order to get it done. I can also, by the way, describe several strategies that didn't succeed over the years, because if you're in the business that we're in, that sometimes is certainly the case. You do not succeed every time.
I think the key is to learn from your mistakes or pivot, and I'm sure you've had many examples of that.
Oh yeah, well the mistakes, it's interesting because the mistakes that we usually find as we do a post-mortem on some of the businesses that don't succeed, usually at the core of those mistakes in our business, it's about not having bad people, but having the wrong people for a particular kind of business. If you're going to be in a marketing business, you have to be careful not to hire a technologically sophisticated person. They have very different skill sets. Frequently also, we have found that founders and early stage entrepreneurs who have wonderful talent in terms of bringing the idea to its first level, if you will, those are not the right people to run businesses once they get a little traction. So in the main, most of the problems that one sees when doing the kinds of things that we do at Loeb Holding have to do with making sure we have the right people with the right skill sets. And then, once we have those people, helping them develop their skills as the businesses grow.
So it sounds like execution is a big part.
I have a saying in my business: give me a mediocre product and a team that is really skilled in execution, and I'll take that every day of the week over a spectacular product and a mediumly skilled team of executors.
Speaking of talented teams, I think that you've mentioned you have some strong partnerships. And on the political side, what happens when, for example, Albertine Enterprises? Can you tell me a little bit about that relationship?
Sure. Actually, that relationship dovetails with a comment that I just made earlier about our weather data collection and forecasting business. When we early on started that business, I recognized that one of our primary potential customers was going to be the U.S. government, whether the National Weather Service, that is always looking to improve its forecasting capabilities, or the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, which is the principal disseminator of weather forecasts for the aviation and maritime industries in this country, and abroad, by the way. One of the things that I learned, and I mentioned earlier when I was talking about outsourcing, is stick to your knitting. And I made a decision that if we were going to, in our aviation weather business, if we were going to try to interface with various government agencies, we needed to find the right team to help us do that. And the right team for us, and it has been the case for 20 years or so at this point, was Albertine Enterprises. I interviewed several different government affairs advising companies and lobbyists here in Washington before selecting the Albertine team to become our lobbyists, starting with the aviation weather data collection business. And that partnership, which was very successful in the aviation business, expanded to several other of the businesses that we've developed over the years, particularly those businesses that want, or should have commercial relationships with various government agencies. And sometimes not necessarily commercial relationships, but just establishing the presence of what our business does with various legislators, so that in particular areas of the legislators' interests, they know, whether it's congressmen or senators, they know about the companies that might be of interest to them with the solutions that those companies have. I made the decision to hire Albertine Enterprises for several different reasons, all of which dovetailed into an overall decision, which I am grateful for every day that we interface with them here in Washington and elsewhere, by the way. The decision was based on my conclusion, after interviewing several different firms recommended by some of our colleagues, that there are two kinds of government affairs advisors in Washington. One is the very large firm that produces important position papers, white papers so-called, gives you a clear understanding of the issues that are before the House or the Senate or before any of the agencies, and talks about the pros and the cons of what those positions are and what the agencies might do. Very important to have that if you're trying to understand where your particular company and its solutions fit in. And then there's another kind of government affairs advisory organization, and that's the kind of organization where the people in the organization actually know where the doors are to get into the House and Senate office buildings. And not just where the doors are, but they are the people who actually know and have long-term, highly credible relationships with the folks that make it happen. That is to say, the elected congressmen and senators, and with particular emphasis, the professional staffs of the various committees that operate in the House and Senate. I found in the Albertine organization, Jim and Jack Albertine and the people that work with them, I found a unique combination of people that actually knew our elected representatives. You'd walk down the hall in the Hart Senate office building, and Senator Lieberman would walk by Jim Albertine and say, "Hey Jim, how are you? I haven't seen you in my office lately. Come on by and say hello." That's the kind of relationship that is hugely important, particularly when you want to bring a particular point of view or issue in front of one of your elected congressmen or senators. But the unique additional factor in selecting Albertine Enterprises as my go-to firm in D.C. is they not only knew the folks, elected folks, but they also knew their professional staffs. And frequently, for those who don't understand how Washington works, the professional staffs for the various committees, which are chaired and co-chaired by various elected folks in the House and Senate, the professional staffs are the advisors to the elected representatives and senators, and they need to be particularly well versed on the issues that you want to make sure they know about. So having advisors here in DC in the name of and form of Albertine Enterprises gave me and my companies somewhat unique access to the real people who do the hard work of legislating in this country. And there was a last piece of this puzzle which I came to understand fairly quickly, and deciding to use on a very long-term basis my friends at Albertine Enterprises. They are very careful, Jim, Jack Albertine and their staffs and colleagues are very careful not to bring before a senator, a congressman, or his or her staffs stories. They bring before those folks real facts, unvarnished, unbiased, so that even when they're touting a particular point of view, which they're certainly expected to do for a particular client like us, they're completely credible. They don't, if you will, blow smoke. Mm-hmm. They tell it as it is, and thus, when the senator or congressman listens, he or she knows that they're getting a straight story.